themselves from God by refusing to receive his sign. Okay? They have not the spirit of God's true commandment keeping people. You know, the Adventists will say, no, we are still keeping the 7-day Sabbath. Yes, you know, they're still going to church on Saturday, but the question is, are they keeping it? Are they keeping it holy? Remember the fourth commandment, it says there, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. No, we're supposed to keep it holy though. You know, we cannot just go to church on Saturday and not keeping it holy, because if we are not keeping it holy, then we are actually refusing to receive that sign. Remember, the Sabbath is the seal of God. Okay, that's why it says here, they have not the spirit of God's true commandment keeping people. So in other words, the churches today, they lost that God's true commandment keeping people. You know, they go to church in the morning, and in the afternoon they go back home. You know, they're having meetings in the morning only. You know, some of the churches, they're only having meetings in the morning. In the afternoon, they don't have meetings anymore. They go back home. Sometimes they go to bed. So basically, they have not the spirit of God's true commandment keeping people. And the people of the world, in giving their sanction to a false Sabbath and in trampling under their feet the Sabbath of the Lord, have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. In other words, if you don't make it holy, the Sabbath, you know, if you are not, even though you go to church, but you're not keeping it holy, it says here that it seems like you have drunk of the wine of the wrath over fornication. Okay, and that's exactly what it is, and that's why in the book of volume 8 of the testimonies to the church, it says here, it is a solemn and terrible truth that many who have been zealous in proclaiming the third angel's message are now becoming listless and indifferent. The line of demarcation between worldlings and many professed Christians is almost indistinguishable. Many who once were earnest Adventists are conforming to the world. Wow. To its practices, its customs, its selfishness. Instead of leading the world to render obedience to God's law, the church is uniting more and more closely with the world in transgression. So the churches today are conforming to the world, to its practices, to its customs. Okay? Daily, the church is becoming converted to the world. How many professing Christians are slaves of mammon, their indulgence of appetite, their extravagant expenditure of money for selfish gratification greatly dishonors God. So basically, that all the churches, even our own church, even our own East Day church, are conforming. Do we have a proof now that they're actually conforming to the world? Now, I have this document that I gathered from the past. That, remember, in California, they have what we call Rose Parade every year. This is what every New Year, actually. Every New Year they have a parade. Now remember that we're not supposed to, as a Christian, we're supposed to be separate and peculiar. Right? We don't go along with what the world is doing. But look what happened here. This is one of the documents that was being published by the Adventist Review. And it says here, Seventh-day Adventist Church joining the Rose Parade in, what's the name of that town there? Pasadena, right? Pasadena, California. That's it. And you know what? In my understanding, that as they joined this Rose Parade, they were being awarded. Yeah, they got the prize. Okay. And so another photos here, right here also. This is another float. I don't know what year was this, but I know that the year that they joined, I can't remember the year, but it was published at the Adventist Review. So Seventh-day Adventist Church, they joined that Rose Parade. And that's exactly what the testimonies to the church they're conforming to the world, to its practices. And that's the reason why God has not come yet. God has not come yet. Why? Because his people are not ready yet. We are still here. Okay? And you think Christ is not willing to come? Did Christ design that he will delay his coming? According to it says here that it was not the will of God that the coming of Christ should be thus delayed. God did not design that his people, Israel, should wander 40 years in the wilderness. He promised to lead them directly to the land of Canaan and establish them there a holy, healthy, happy people. But those to whom it was first preached went not in because of unbelief. Because of unbelief. Their hearts were filled with murmuring, rebellion, and hatred, and he could not fulfill his covenant with them. Okay? 40 years did unbelief, murmuring, and rebellion shut out ancient Israel from the land of Canaan. The same sins have delayed the entrance of modern Israel into the heavenly Canaan. In neither case were the promises of God at fault. It is the unbelief, the worldliness, the unconsecration, and strife among the Lord's professed people that have kept us in this world of sin and sorrow so many years. So what prevented Christ coming the second time here? What delays his coming is because of unbelief and worldliness. People are conforming to the world. Okay? That's what it says that daily the church is converted to the world. And that's why, according to 1NL, it says here that the church is in a Laodicean state. The presence of God is not in her midst. If Christ were formed within the hope of glory, conformity to his image would be seen. And the church trials which separate the members from Christ would disappear. That's exactly the reason why Christ has not come yet. Because God's people are conforming to the world. We should not follow that. As much as we can, we should stay. We can be in the world, but not of the world. Okay? That's why there is a call. Because since all nations, all the churches have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication, there is a final call. That's Revelation 18, verse 4. Come out of her, my people, that ye be not partakers of her sins. So God is actually calling his people out. Now, what's going to happen if the church becomes lukewarm? Remember, the church, it says here, the church is in a Laodicean state. That means the church today have become Laodiceans. When they started, they were actually in a Philadelphian condition. That was in 1844. When they got out, they were organized in 1863. And then for how many years, actually, they become Laodicean state. Why? Because of conforming to the world. Okay? Now, if the church becomes Laodicean, what's going to happen though? It says here, if the church of God becomes lukewarm, it does not stand in favor with God anymore. Then do the churches that are represented as having fallen and become the habitations of devils and the hold of every foul spirit and a cage of every unclean and hateful bird. Those who have had opportunities to hear and receive the truth and looks like I lost the signal here. All right, I'm sorry about that. Let me try to share again. Okay, let me try to share it. There you go. All right, let me. All right. Yeah, my looks like my internet went down a little bit, so I I lost the signal. But in a way, thank you. So if the church becomes lukewarm, it says here, it does not stand in favor with God anymore. Then do the churches that are represented as having fallen and become the habitations of devils and the hold of every foul spirit and the cage of every unclean and hateful bird. So those who have had opportunities to hear and receive the truth and who have united with the Seventh-day Adventist Church, calling themselves the commandment-keeping people of God, and yet possess no more vitality and consecration to God than do the nominal churches, will receive of the plagues of God just as verily as the churches who oppose the law of God. So the same thing, they will. Okay. Okay. So only those that are sanctified through the truth will compose the royal family in the heavenly mansions Christ has gone to prepare for those that love him and keep his commandments. So only those who are sanctified through the truth will compose, okay, the royal family in the heavenly mansions Christ has prepared. So that is, okay, hold on, okay, there you go. So that's what happened when the church becomes Laodiceans. That means it cannot stand anymore. In other words, God cannot accept a Laodicean conditioned church. They might say that, oh, this is the church that God is going to save. No, they will be spewed out according to Revelation. Revelation is so clear. Revelation 3:14-20, that the Laodicean will be spewed out from Christ. Christ cannot accept that kind of condition. You need to get out of that condition and become a Philadelphian so that Christ can accept. That's why we need to, we don't want to become Laodicean. Laodiceans are what? They're lukewarm. That means they're half converted Christians, they're not fully converted. They're half Christians. They're lukewarm. They're not hot. They're not cold. They are in the middle. So now that means all the churches actually have drunk of the wine. Now, what is the wine though? Okay. What is the wine? Let's look at that. What is the wine of Babylon? Now, according to Great Controversy, it says here that the great sin charged against Babylon is that she made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. This cup of intoxication, okay, which she presents to the world, represents the false doctrines that she has accepted as the result of her unlawful connection with the great ones of the earth. Friendship with the world corrupts her faith. So friendship with the world corrupts her faith. And in her turn, she exerts a corrupting influence upon the world by teaching doctrines which are opposed to the plainest statements of the Holy Writ. In other words, teaching doctrines that are opposed to the Bible. So friendship with the world corrupts her faith. In other words, that's what 1 John 2:15, right? Love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. For if you love the world, the love of the Father is not in you. So God is giving us a warning that we are not supposed to love the world. We can be in the world, but not of the world. Okay? So what are the false doctrines though? Okay? Let's look at that. What are the false doctrines that she's teaching actually? It says here, this wine of error is made up of false doctrines, such as the natural immortality of the soul, the eternal torment of the wicked, the denial of the pre-existence of Christ prior to his birth, in Bethlehem, and advocating and exalting the first day of the week above God's holy and sanctified day. This and kindred errors are presented to the world by the various churches, and thus the scriptures are fulfilled that say, "For all nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath over fornication." So in other words, when you have this kind of doctrines, you have drunk of the wine of Rome. Okay? Now let's explain one by one here though. The natural immortality of the soul. What is that? Natural immortality of the soul. Now remember that we are mortal, right? We are not immortal, we are mortal. In other words, we die. Remember that the soul that sinneth, it shall die. The soul that sinneth, it shall die. In other words, if we continue sinning, we will die, because that's what it says there. But remember, Satan said to Eve in the Garden of Eden, Satan said to Eve, no, even if you eat this fruit, you will not die. That was the first sermon of the natural immortality of the soul being preached by Satan in the Garden of Eden. In other words, even though you keep sinning, you will not die. And that's exactly what the churches are trying to preach to the followers of Christ, to the members. That we're only human beings, we make mistakes. But when Jesus comes, he's going to change us. He's going to save us. No, we are not being saved in sin. Jesus said in the book of Matthew that the Christ came to save us from sin, not in sin. Okay? So that is the natural immortality of the soul. We don't do that. We don't believe that. We need to attain perfection. Okay, that's Matthew 5:49, Matthew 5:48. Be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father which is in heaven is perfect. No, we don't do that. This is one of the doctrines of false doctrines of Rome. Also, the eternal torment of the wicked. Now, we don't teach that. No, the Adventist doesn't teach that. But the natural immortality of the soul, they believe that. Also, the denial of the pre-existence of Christ prior to his birth. There's a lot of people today that doesn't believe the pre-existence of Christ. They think that Christ was begotten. Christ was being created by the Father. That's what some of the movements today, there are some movements believing that Christ was actually being created. No, Christ, before his humanity was created, yes, but his divinity was not created. Christ was already there in heaven before he came down in this earth. He already existed from the beginning. And it says there in Desire of Ages that you cannot even measure, or no figures, So, but these are actually some of the false doctrines of Rome, and advocating and exalting the first day of the week above God's holy and sanctified day. Now, the Adventist is still keeping the seventh-day Sabbath. But are they really making it holy? If they are not making it holy, that means they are exalting the first day of the week. In other words, they are actually guilty of this false doctrine, this wine of Babylon. Okay? This wine of Babylon. That's why it says here that this and kindred errors are presented to the world by the various churches. So in other words, the churches are actually embracing this, and thus the scriptures are fulfilled that say, all nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of fornication. Now, how does Rome exalted the first day of the week? Now, if you look at this quotations from 7 BC, okay, I only have a few more slides. It says here, God denounces Babylon because she made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. This means that she has disregarded the only commandment, okay, the only commandment which points out the true God, and has torn down the Sabbath, God's memorial of creation. So Rome actually exalted the first day of the week. How does he do it? He torn down the Sabbath. How does he turn down the Sabbath? By making it, okay, exactly what Rome is doing to the churches of today. Making, it says there, making all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. How does Rome turn down the Sabbath? It says here, this is from 40 to 47. In January 1875, I was shown that there are hindrances in the way of the spiritual prosperity of the church. The Spirit of God is grieved because many are not right in heart and life. Their professed faith does not harmonize with their works. The sacred rest day of Jehovah is not observed as it should be. So in other words, the Sabbath is not being observed as it should be. Every week, God is wrapped. That's exactly what the churches are doing today. They are not making the Sabbath holy. They can just go to church, but they are not actually keeping it holy, you know? And that's exactly what Rome is trying to do to all the churches. That's how he turned down the Sabbath. And the churches today are also doing it. That's why they are the daughters of Rome, because they have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornications. So every week God is robbed by some infringement upon the borders of his holy time. And the hours that should be devoted to prayer and meditation are given to worldly employments. In other words, they can go to church on Saturday, but, they're just there to talk of anything, discuss anything, maybe they're doing Facebook on Sabbath or anything, talking about business or job or how much money you make, So that's exactly what the churches are doing. And that's why all the churches have drunk of the wine of the wrath of fornications. That's why it says there, many will meet with bitter disappointment in the day of God. Why? Why many people, many churches will experience a bitter disappointment? Because they will not receive the seal of God. It says here, the great mass of professing Christians will meet with bitter disappointment in the day of God. Why? They have not upon their foreheads the seal of the living God. Lukewarm and half-hearted, they dishonor God far more than the avowed unbeliever. So they are lukewarm, half-hearted Christians. That's the reason why they are not sealed. They don't receive the seal of God. They group in darkness when they might be walking in the noonday light of the word, under the guidance of the one who never errs. So how can we receive the seal? Are there conditions? Are there conditions that we need to do so that we can receive the seal of God? So how can we receive the seal? If we want to have the seal of God, we should keep the seventh-day Sabbath. Remember that the Sabbath is not being sacredly kept. Okay, it's not being kept. So it says here in 7 BC 970, those who would have the seal of God in their forehead must keep the Sabbath of the fourth commandment. This is what distinguishes them from the disloyal who have accepted a man-made institution in the place of the true Sabbath. The observance of God's rest day is the mark of distinction between him that serveth God and him that serveth him not. So first, we have to keep the 7-day Sabbath according to the commandment if we want to have the seal of God. Now, how do we truly keep the Sabbath? It says here, this is how do we truly keep the Sabbath? It says here in Isaiah. This is from the book of Isaiah. If we truly want to keep the Sabbath, okay, if thou turn away thy foot from the Sabbath, from doing thy pleasure on my holy day. Remember, the 7th-day Sabbath is called my holy day. That is the day of God, the 7th-day Sabbath. And call the Sabbath a delight, the holy of the Lord, honorable, and shalt honor him, not doing thine own ways. So in other words, if we truly keep the 7th-day Sabbath, we should not do our own ways, it says there. Okay? Nor finding thine own pleasure. That's it. Okay? We cannot just decide, oh, I'm going, this is what I'm going to do on the Sabbath. No, the Sabbath is not for you. It's for the Lord. Okay? It's for the Lord. All the 24 hours is actually a holy day. Okay? Is designed for us to have time with the Lord. Nor speaking thine own words. In other words, we cannot just be speaking anything. We have to be speaking only the things of God on Sabbath. Okay? So not doing thine own ways, nor finding thine own pleasure, nor speaking thine own words, then shalt thou delight thyself in the Lord. Okay? And I will cause thee to ride upon the high places of the earth, and feed thee with the heritage of Jacob thy father, for the mouth of the Lord hath spoken it. So in other words, that's how we truly keep the 7th-day Sabbath. We have to spend time with the Lord. It doesn't mean that we have to be inside the church or inside the house. We can actually spend Sabbath outside, outdoors. We can go nature. Spend Sabbath in nature. There's nothing wrong, as long as we don't do our own thing, nor finding thine own ways, nor speaking thine own words. Then we will be keeping truly the 7th-day Sabbath if we do that. So that ends my study, and this is actually my last slides. And so that's the second angel's message.